Here with Jake and Ryan. Ryan, how's it going?
Hey, Jake, man, good to be here. Good to hang out. It's week 2 for crying out loud, so we're just getting started.
They allowed us to week 2.
I know, it's nice. They didn't say you guys are terrible. You're not allowed to come back. So, yeah, man, it's good to be back for week 2. End of a work day for me. Not so much for you.
It's my Sunday.
Oh, must be nice.
It's not. Hey, so go ahead and tell me a little bit about the new series we're starting, what it's about, and where we're going to be hanging out primarily.
All right, so it's called Creative God, and it's all focused on and talking about how God is not just the creator, but he is creative, and about how since we have his spirit that's been breathed into us, that we are also creative, which is really cool, and about how that creativity is made to be used for the good of the church, for our own personal edification, to point us to God and to point other people to Jesus. So That's kind of where we're going with it, and we kicked off this week with creation. So why not, man?
One of the best and hardest points to start out with.
It always kind of comes down like that. So.
Alrighty, and my first note that I have on here is that you're an expert level air guitar player.
Hey man, Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure veteran right here. Wild Stallions for life. So that is literally the only instrument I play besides the iPod. So that's about all I got. So yeah.
All right. So one of the actual notes that I do have on here for you is that you mentioned early on that somewhere along the line, or actually early, the church was a part of the culture of all art, and that somewhere that we had just kind of pushed that culture away. Mm-hmm. Explain a little bit more on that.
So, man, when you go back and look historically at the rise of the church through culture, particularly the culture in Europe, what you see is the best artists, the best writers, the best thinkers at that point, at different points in time, were coming out of the church. Like, for example, A Pilgrim's Progress, is a fantastic work of literature. It was written because of the church and inside of the church.
Right.
If you look at, art inside of the great cathedrals, they didn't go and get, Joe Blow to do his stick figure drawings. They went and got, the Michelangelos of the day to do that kind of stuff. You look at the great composers. Many of them were composing inside of the church. And somewhere along the way, particularly in the Americas, we lost that. The fundamentalist modernist controversy historically kind of cost us a lot of that. It caused Christians to kind of withdraw and try to stay away from culture. And you even see that right up until the Billy Graham Evangelistic Association started to say, hey, when there's all these people going to film, we should start making films. And the problem is that they didn't make very good films.
Right.
And so Christian art kind of became this kitschy, niche kind of shadow of what was being produced inside secular society, and flat out just wasn't very good. But it sold a lot because there were a lot of Christians that were being told, this is the only stuff you can listen to, and this is the only stuff you can watch, and this is the only stuff you can read. And so it wound up with, we just kind of began to accept lesser and lesser quality. And then we blamed the big bad world for not appreciating our art, when the truth of the matter is, in a lot of cases, it was really, really bad art. And then when someone would rise to a high level and really do art really well, that the broader culture began to take notice to, the question would then become, are they going to sell out? And we heard that over and over again. We heard it a lot, in particular in the music industry.
We kind of hear that still right now, going on with like the Lauren Daigle's.
Very, very, very much. Yeah, Lauren Daigle is a perfect modern example of that. In my age range, it was DC Talk. DC Talk was this huge hit inside the Christian subculture, and then they kind of began to cross over, and people began to take notice of them. It was like, well, are they going to sell out? And it's frustrating, because the truth of the matter is, if Christians are making really good art, then they should be celebrated, and because they're offering their very best to their creator. And there's nothing wrong if the art you're creating is the very best you can create. That's a great offering to be able to give to God. Right. But if you're just doing it halfway because it will sell, then that's as much blasphemy as taking the Lord's name in vain, because it's like, well, I know this will sell, so this is what I'm going to do. Right. So that's kind of where we wound up with that.
Alrighty, and just a perfect point. I mean, you listen to rap, so. And you do rap very well, so that is your art, despite what you're
not my art. I rap other people's raps very well.
So, in what you were talking about on Sunday, you said Scripture isn't meant to be read like a normal novel.
Right.
And we see that particularly in Genesis 1 and 2. So explain to me and explain to those listening in why we read those so differently.
So that's kind of a two-part question. Why we don't read Scripture like a novel is because Scripture's not laid out like a novel.
Right.
It does have a definitive beginning in Genesis 1 with the creation story, and it does have a definitive ending in the book of Revelation with kind of the end of the beginning, which would be the return or the restoration of all things through the return of Christ.
Right.
But in between the histories and the Psalms and things like that, they're not designed to read like a linear narrative. And that's because the purpose of Scripture is to explain to us the work that God has done to save humanity.
Right.
It's a redemption story. And so when we approach Scripture and try to treat it as like it's a novel, it gets really confusing because it's like characters appear and disappear and then disappear for good and then they don't come back and then they're referenced weirdly and all these different things. And so it can become very confusing for somebody who doesn't really understand that. That's one of the things that makes Genesis 1 and 2 such a difficult thing for a lot of people to grab a hold of, because Genesis 1 and really bleeding over into the first few verses of chapter 2, which just goes to show that chapter subdivisions were added later, is written as epic poetry. It's written, I'm not going to say allegorically because I think it's recording true events that actually happened, but it's not intended in the format, in the genre that it's written in, if you will, to try to communicate time. It's meant to put the emphasis on God as God being in charge of creation. And then Genesis 2 is meant to show not just the care that God gives for his creation, but his plan for man and for humankind, and to explain the introduction of woman as the companion for man. So the two take on very different meanings and roles. And you can see that because if you look at Genesis 2, there's even some slight order differences in the way things are created. So it becomes this very confusing thing if you try to treat it as, well, this is my scientific textbook for how the science of the creation of the world works.
Right.
Well, that's really a terrible textbook for environmental science or biology, but it's a great theological introduction to who is in charge of creation, and that is God, through whatever processes or time he determined to use to create the world as we know it.
Right. Something that you did also mention, you did just very gingerly touch it as far as the creation of everything, is that it was not by accident.
Nope.
It was not just a whole bunch of atoms just deciding to do something. And you're well aware, I went to a secret church this year, and one of the things that they started out with is that God is the supreme creator. That was the first bullet, like the very first bullet point once we get into actual scripture. And one of the things that he said on there, and it was something along this line, is you can't make something out of nothing. Nothing creates nothing.
Right.
And so it just kind of goes along with that narrative that you were saying. And those of you listening, you're not an accident.
No, you're not.
Not at all.
And I think that for me is the worst part of macroevolutionary biology, is that it gives you this idea that somehow or another we dredged ourselves up from the slime, rather than we were created by an infinitely powerful and good creator.
A limitless power to God.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's one of the things that lends itself to a lot of the nihilism of our time, is when you think you're an accident, then nothing you do really matters. If you think that you're an intentional creation made in the image of God, then you are something of value, but so is everybody else. Right. And so it's a lot easier to treat other people terribly when you don't see them as having value because they are made in the image of God.
Right. And going back on the creation portion of it, and as far as Genesis 1 and 2, how is creation not random in these two books?
Because it says that God has this specific order. I mean, you literally see him saying, I created this and it is good. I created this and it was good. And over again, as he's speaking it into existence, and you see it building on itself. I mean, he doesn't create fish that have to breathe out of water until after he's created an ocean.
Right.
He doesn't have the water be covering over the land and then create the mammals to swim around. He creates the land. He doesn't create mankind, the pinnacle of his creation, until everything else is already formed and set, and then he makes man unique amongst all of his creations. So when we look at the orderliness of creation, we see the progression of God as he makes and builds. And if he wanted to snap his fingers and do it all at once, he could have, but he doesn't. He takes time and he takes care to build it in an orderly fashion. And that's one of the things is that from Scripture, from the New Testament, is it says God is not the author of chaos. And I think we see that even in the creation of the world.
Right, and it goes back to the how is it not just completely random? And you made a really good point. As you said, the creation point is kind of like Lego building blocks. You can't do, the top of the mountain first. You got to build the base for it, or else it's going to look really weird having this little tiny top on top of this really big mountain.
Yeah, exactly.
So it was a good point on this. And as you continued going on, you talked about the purpose of man. The purpose is not to get to the weekend. It's to get to the purpose of man is to work. Expand on that for me.
Yeah, so I think that's one of the things that we see that's really corrupted by the fall is that a man is given the command by God to work and keep. And that turns into a curse after the fall, where man is told that his work will produce toil and thorns, and no longer will be necessarily pleasurable. But we were never created to just sit around fat and sassy. I mean, I think that's one of the things that some people talk about. When we get to heaven, when everything's perfect, we're just going to be able to sit and rest and do. No, I don't think that's the case, because I think that what we're envisioning is like we're some sultan lounging on pillows while the slave girls run about. That's not the case in any way, shape, or form. Man was created to work. There's a reason why human beings have this innate desire to do things and to produce. I think the thing is, though, is that because we exist in a fallen, broken world, work is not always enjoyable. And so that's one of the reasons why one of the things that I said on Sunday is when you find something that you're able to do that should be work, and it may be work to somebody else, but to you it brings joy. That's the place where God is saying to you, this is your space. This is not just your work, this is your calling. And I think that some people get to experience that as a full-time job, but other people only get to experience that as something that they get to do once their full-time job is taken care of. I mean, I'm at my best, I'm at my peak when I'm doing what we're doing right now, when I'm talking about theology, whether I'm preaching or in a conversation or whatever. And I'm thankful to have a job, and I'm thankful to get a chance to do what I do, but my calling is ultimately to do this kind of stuff. And that's where my heart sings. So I think that's the thing, is that we get a peek at what work was like in the garden when we're in that situation.
Right, and you also talked about the joy of creation in your work, just kind of what you're elaborating on that.
Yeah.
Kind of go more into what that is.
So I think every kind of work that we do produces something. I mean, like for example, there are some women that their greatest calling in life is to be a mom. And so the work that they're doing is pouring into their children, and their children are producing fruit. That's creative. That's helping to grow up and create a good, productive, intelligent human being. And that is a huge thing that a mom does. It's a creative act. Some people, their acts of work and things that they do, they create words or poems or songs or whatever. Some people, their work is their artisanship. They're an architect. They put windows in, or that's the thing that God's really given them the ability to do. And so I think that's the thing, is all work is in some way, shape, or form an act of creation. Not creating out of nothing, not equating ourselves with God, but building something, putting something together that has an end, and that produces to an end where we can step back and go, that was what I was built to do.
Okay. That's really good. Really good points. I'm going to go back and listen to that and take notes. And also you were going into this, and it's kind of in my notes over here that I have from Secret Church, and this is really a hard thing to probably when you're new in Christianity, or just kind of in general, explain sovereignty.
So
how God is sovereign.
So
or
if
however you
God,
wanna
if
have
God is sovereign, a better way to say that is God is in ultimate charge. So I think the easiest thing for us to imagine is a king inside of a kingdom where he is the pinnacle of power, and everybody else exists to serve him. And a bad king is a bad sovereign. He is somebody that makes his people's lives hard. God is a good king. He's an infinitely good king. And so when he reigns over humanity, he reigns sovereignly over the world as he's dictating things that are going on and in control. Then he's working, as we're told in Romans, all things for the good of those who love him, who are called according to his purpose. And so I think that for the earthly wise, that's probably the closest we can get to a description. But to be sovereign means to be ruler, to be in charge. And when he's all sovereign or all powerful, omnipotent, one of the Omni doctrines, he's all powerful over all the world, over literally over time itself. Did that do a decent job of explaining it?
Yes, you did.
Okay. Just checking, man. You never know.
You're right. And one of the last things that you end on, you had a list of 4 things about creation. And you said humanity is the only creation that was given a task.
Yeah.
You also said humanity was the only part of creation that had a warning, and that was given God's breath and was created in God's image.
Mm-hmm.
Expand on God's image. How were we created in that? Because when we look at people, I mean, I've got a nice full head of hair. You don't. I mean, we both share the big ear trait.
We do both share that. So when we're talking about someone being created in God's image, we're not talking about them being created to where they look like God as much as they're crafted with a decision-making will and with value. God is infinitely valuable, and so when we're created in his image, it means we inherit that value, but it also means we inherit that ability to make decisions, to have a will of our own, and the ability to say yes to things and no to things. And that's why the fall is such a horrible thing, is because man is created in God's image, and yet he ignores the warning that his image maker gives him, and that corrupts his image. So that takes us from being like God to being less like God, because then sin is entered in and God is sinless. And so that creates this issue and this problem for us. And that's what happens when we trust Jesus, is he resets that image. Is we begin to take on more of the image of God, reflecting his holiness and his righteousness and his mercy and his grace and all the amazing qualities. And that's perfected when we leave the broken world and enter into glory. And we've talked about it before, not on this show, but many times at church, about how for the Christian there's the justification, which is the moment of salvation. There's the process of sanctification, which extends from the time justification occurs to the end of one's life, when one stops breathing. And then there's glorification, when we enter into God's kingdom and we become what we fully intended to be. So at that point in time, we're then full image bearers.
Perfect.
Cool. Awesome.
I'll end on this last quote.
Okay, but so we got time for one more. What you got?
It's a quote. It's not really a question. But as we were kind of going through this song kind of popped into my head, and just and this verse in that song, and I don't really think about it a whole lot. It's not my favorite song out of this album, but it's one of Beautiful Eulogies. The song is You Can Save Me, and in there he says, but if God made man, how can man make a God and make a claim that God is confined to fit within a frame?
They're always strong, man.
Oh my gosh, they're so good.
All that Humble Beast click is good.
Oh, it's so good.
All that Humble Beast click is good. Yeah, that's
so
strong.
it's just a nice little quote, little verse there to end today on.
Cool.
And I don't have any other questions.
Awesome. I feel like I've been through the third degree, man. It's
Have
good
you?
stuff. Hey, in all seriousness, just a reminder, if you have questions anytime we get done on Sunday, you can send them to me, you can send them to Jake, you can post them in the Facebook feed. We'll do our best to get to them here on the third degree. This is going to be posting, it looks like, on Wednesdays. Yeah, so y'all be sure to check us out, share in your Facebook feeds, pass it around, let people know. And we'll see you next week on the third degree after we see you at West Metro on Sunday.
That's right.
Later.
Later.